I'm sorry. Is that some kind of joke? The voice, slick with condescension, cut through the stale air of the command tent. It belonged to Lieutenant Hartley, a fresh-faced young officer whose confidence was as sharp as the pressed creases in his uniform. He stared down at the old man, sitting calmly on the bench. You're telling me you actually have a rank, old man? Jack Donovan didn't flinch. His hands rested steadily on the worn handles of his cane, his eyes focused on the far corner of the tent, as if he had heard these questions 1,000 times before. The other officers in the room smirked, some even chuckling, but Jack remained silent. Hartley's smirk only grew wider as he crossed his arms. Tell me, what's your rank? Sergeant Major? Or maybe you were a Major General before you retired? The words hung in the air like a challenge. He didn't expect an answer. The older man looked like nothing more than a relic from a past era, too old to be of any use in this modern military. It's not just the hardware that's obsolete, Hartley continued, his voice oozing with sarcasm. Tell me, what was your job back in the day? Clean the barracks. Jack turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes locking with Hartley's. His voice was low but steady. I was a general. A 4-star general. But these days, I do the work nobody else wants to. The room fell quiet. It wasn't just the words, but the way Jack said them. There was no boast, no pride, just a statement of fact. The others in the room shifted uncomfortably, as if trying to process the revelation. Hartley blinked, his smirk faltering for a split second, but he quickly recovered. General? Right. You're telling me you were once the head of Special Forces? He scoffed. I'm sure they'd love to know what happened to you. Jack didn't respond. He simply stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, measured. I've been there, Jack said softly, more to himself than anyone else. The others in the room watched him, puzzled, but unsure of how to respond. Jack took a step toward the edge of the tent. It doesn't matter, he muttered, more to the wind than to anyone present. The mission's over, but I'll be damned if I'm not going to help you finish yours. The young officers around the room exchanged uncertain glances. Some still didn't believe him. Others started to wonder if maybe this old man wasn't just another veteran with too many stories to tell. One young officer, Lieutenant Thompson, walked up behind him, a questioning look on his face. General Donovan, do you mind telling me what you're doing here? Jack paused for a moment, then turned to face Thompson, his expression unreadable. I came here to observe, he said. Just like you, Lieutenant. He left it at that, and for the first time that day, there was a silence that was deeper than mere words. Thompson felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't know why. He had to know more. You've been with Special Forces for how long? Jack's eyes narrowed, but there was no anger in them. Long enough to know when to leave. The officers fell silent again, none of them sure of what to make of this man who stood before them. Just then, the door to the tent flung open, and a familiar voice rang out. Lieutenant, there's a situation. The commanding officer, Colonel Ryan, strode into the room. His gaze instantly landed on Jack. General Donovan, what are you doing here? Jack didn't answer right away. He just stood there, calm, with a slight nod. Colonel Ryan's face darkened for a moment before he turned to the rest of the officers. All of you, stand at attention. The officers snapped to attention in unison, the room now radiating with the presence of a man who commanded respect. Jack's name had triggered something inside Colonel Ryan, a long-forgotten respect for a man whose actions were etched in the history of the Special Forces. The colonel's eyes hardened as he addressed the room. General Donovan here doesn't need to prove anything. His name alone should tell you all you need to know. Jack stood motionless as the room absorbed his words. He hadn't spoken to impress anyone. He wasn't here to earn anyone's approval. But in that moment, the room understood. Jack Donovan wasn't just a man who had served. He was a legend whose reputation still carried weight. The room stayed quiet, the tension hanging thick in the air. Dismissed, Colonel Ryan said finally. But none of them moved immediately. The weight of the silence was too strong, too profound to ignore. As the officers filed out, Jack stayed standing, a lone figure against the backdrop of the tent. His silence spoke volumes, and in that moment, the old soldier had said everything he needed to. Ignoring the murmur of confusion that still lingered in the room, Jack Donovan slowly turned to face the young officers who had been snickering moments earlier. His posture was straight, his movements deliberate, yet there was no anger in his eyes. Just a quiet strength that spoke of years of experience. The awkwardness in the room was palpable, but Jack didn't seem to care. He had seen much worse in his time. The tension was only broken when Lieutenant Hartley cleared his throat, his voice shaking slightly. I didn't know. Hartley stammered, his earlier bravado now replaced with a trace of guilt. Jack remained silent, his gaze unwavering. The colonel, still standing in the doorway, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "General Donovan," he said, his voice commanding but softer than usual, "we've been given new orders. It seems the training mission has taken a new direction." Jack gave a slight nod, his eyes scanning the room as if assessing the young officers in front of him. "I figured as much," he muttered, almost to himself. "Training is never what it seems. But the real lessons, the ones that matter, are never taught in these tents." The colonel's expression shifted as he looked back at the young men, who were now avoiding eye contact. "General Donovan, I assume you'll be ready to lead when the time comes?" The question was directed at Jack, but it felt as if it was meant for the entire room. Jack looked at the colonel, then back at the young officers. "I've been ready," he said quietly. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. The colonel gestured toward the exit, signaling the end of the conversation. "All right, let's move out. We've got work to do." As Jack passed through the group of young men, he could feel their eyes on him, some full of respect, others filled with uncertainty. He could see their confusion, their struggle to reconcile the old man they had mocked with the man who had just revealed his rank. But Jack didn't need their approval. He had spent his life earning respect where it counted, not in fleeting moments of bravado. As they moved toward the training field, Jack's mind wandered back to the past. He remembered his days in the field, surrounded by his team, always on edge, always alert. There had been moments of laughter then, too, but it was always in the face of danger, a shared understanding that they were in this together. The young officers, for all their training, didn't have that understanding yet. They still had a lot to learn. The training field was quiet when they arrived. The equipment was already set up, the targets lined up in neat rows. It was a far cry from the chaos Jack had known in his prime. He could almost hear the sounds of gunfire from years past, the steady rhythm of a battle he had long since left behind. But today, he wasn't here to relive the past. He was here to make sure the next generation learned the lessons he had been taught, the hard way. As the officers geared up, Jack moved to the side, his role clear. He wasn't the one who would be barking orders, not today. His presence was enough. The officers were about to face their first real test, and Jack Donovan, a general with decades of experience, would be watching. The quiet veteran, once mocked, was now the silent observer. But in his stillness, he commanded more than anyone else in the room. As the sun began to set over the training field, casting long shadows across the ground, the air was filled with the sound of boots crunching on the gravel. The young officers, once brimming with doubt, were now more focused. The weight of Jack Donovan's presence seemed to hang over them, shaping their every move. They were no longer the brash, overconfident soldiers they had been earlier in the day. They had seen something in Jack that they hadn't expected. They had seen a man who had lived through wars, who had earned his place in history without ever needing to boast about it. The quiet veteran, a man who had once been mocked, had now become the embodiment of experience and respect. Jack stood to the side, his posture relaxed but attentive. He wasn't there to give orders or to lead the exercise. He was there to observe. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the trainees as they set up their equipment. Every movement, every hesitation, didn't go unnoticed. He could see the young officers grappling with the pressure of the moment. There was a level of intensity that only those who had seen combat could truly understand, and Jack had seen it all. The younger soldiers were still learning that it wasn't the gear or the training that made a soldier great. It was the resolve, the ability to stay calm under pressure, and the instinct that couldn't be taught. As the trainees began their drill, Jack's mind wandered back to his own experiences. He remembered the heat of the battlefield, the way time seemed to stretch out in those moments of extreme danger. He had been the one in charge, guiding his men through impossible odds, making split-second decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. It wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about knowing when to act and when to hold back. The sounds of the present seemed to fade as Jack relived those moments in his mind. He could hear the hum of helicopters in the distance, feel the sweat on his brow as he commanded his team through the chaos. But he had learned the hard way. Leadership was never about the uniform or the rank. It was about the respect you earned and the trust you inspired in your people. Jack snapped back to the present as Lieutenant Hartley approached him, his face a mixture of uncertainty and respect. "General Donovan," Hartley began, his voice quieter than before, I wanted to ask about your service. I mean, how did you?" Jack interrupted him, his voice steady. "I didn't do it alone, son. We all do our part. You'll understand one day." Hartley nodded slowly, as if the weight of Jack's words was beginning to sink in. As the young officer turned to rejoin the rest of the team, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They were learning, slowly but surely, what it meant to serve. And though they had no idea yet, they were becoming soldiers in their own right, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Jack's gaze shifted toward the horizon. He had trained countless soldiers in his time, but he knew that the true test of their character would come when they were pushed to their limits. And he would be there, in the background, watching them rise to the occasion, just like he had done all those years ago. The training session continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The officers, now more focused and deliberate in their movements, carried themselves with a new sense of purpose. The respect they had once dismissed was now an integral part of their actions. And Jack Donovan, the quiet veteran who had revealed nothing more than his rank, had silently become their greatest teacher. As the morning sun rose higher in the sky, the sound of boots on gravel echoed across the training field. The young officers had settled into a rhythm, no longer distracted by their earlier doubts or the presence of the old veteran who had revealed more than his rank. Jack Donovan stood off to the side, his gaze steady and thoughtful as he watched the trainees, observing their every move with the kind of insight that only years of experience could provide. It was a familiar sight, young soldiers, full of potential, yet still learning what it meant to truly serve. He could see the small shifts in their behavior, the way they were beginning to think before they acted, the subtle signs of leadership beginning to take root. It was a far cry from the brash, overconfident officers they had been the day before. The training had started as just another routine exercise, but something had changed. They were learning, not just how to follow orders, but how to think critically, to act with purpose, and most importantly, to respect the process. The colonel had given them a task to complete, one that would test their ability to work under pressure. As the trainees moved into position, Jack's mind wandered back to the days when he had faced similar challenges. The stakes had been higher then, lives on the line, but the essence of leadership, of making decisions in the heat of the moment, had always been the same. Jack felt a small pang of nostalgia, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of pride. He had earned his place, not through titles or accolades, but through the quiet respect of those who had served with him. And now, standing on the edge of the field, he could see that same respect beginning to take root in the young soldiers around him. Lieutenant Hartley was at the forefront of the exercise, his demeanor more composed than it had been the day before. Jack watched as he moved with precision, giving orders to his team with a newfound sense of authority. It was clear that he had learned something in the past few hours, something that would stay with him long after the training was over. As the exercise progressed, Jack stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without a word. The trainees, instinctively, fell silent, recognizing the gravity of the moment. Jack wasn't there to lead the exercise. He was there to observe, to ensure that they understood the real lesson. Leadership wasn't about rank. It was about responsibility, about knowing when to step up and when to step back. As the final drill approached, Jack moved closer to the group, his eyes scanning the field for any signs of hesitation or doubt. He could sense that the officers were ready, but they were still holding something back. There was a moment, just before the last task, where everything seemed to hang in the balance. The air was thick with anticipation. Jack knew that this was the moment when true leadership would emerge. As the drill began, Lieutenant Hartley took the lead with confidence, issuing commands with clarity and precision. Jack watched closely, his eyes narrowing as he observed the subtle shift in the young officer's approach. Hartley was no longer just following orders. He was taking ownership of the situation, guiding his team with the kind of calm that only comes with experience. It was in this moment, as the trainees executed the final task flawlessly, that Jack realized the true value of what he had done. He hadn't just taught them tactics or strategies. He had taught them something more. He had shown them what it meant to lead, to earn respect through action, not words. And in that silence, as the exercise came to a close, Jack Donovan knew that these young officers, who had once looked at him with skepticism, had now seen the truth. Leadership wasn't given. It was earned through every decision, every action, and every moment of quiet authority. As the days passed, the young officers grew more accustomed to their roles. The tension that had once gripped the training field was now replaced with a sense of purpose. They moved with more confidence, their actions more deliberate. Jack Donovan, ever the observer, stood on the sidelines, quietly, assessing their progress. It was a strange position for him. He had spent most of his life leading others, but now, he was a mere spectator. Yet, in this new role, he found a certain satisfaction. He could see the change in the young officers. They weren't just following orders anymore. They were beginning to think for themselves, to take ownership of their actions. The transformation was slow, but it was there. Lieutenant Hartley, in particular, had shown significant improvement. The brash, overconfident officer Jack had seen on the first day was gone. In his place was a more thoughtful leader, someone who weighed his decisions before acting. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he watched Hartley issue commands with clarity, his voice steady and confident. It wasn't just the rank that made a leader, it was the respect of those around him, and Hartley was beginning to earn that respect. The rest of the officers followed Hartley's lead, their movements more synchronized, their teamwork improving with each passing day. But there were still moments when doubt crept in, when hesitation slowed them down. Jack knew that was natural. Leadership was learned, not taught. And these young officers were still learning. One afternoon, after the day's drills had ended, Jack found himself alone in the mess hall, sitting at a table by the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the floor. He sat quietly, lost in his thoughts. His mind drifted back to his own time in service, the battles he had fought, the comrades he had lost. He thought of the decisions he had made, the ones that had saved lives, and the ones that had haunted him. Leadership, he had learned, was about making the hard choices, the ones that no one else wanted to make. He had always believed that it was better to be feared than liked, that respect was earned through strength and decisiveness. But as he sat there, looking out at the horizon, he realized something. It wasn't just strength that made a good leader, it was the ability to empathize, to understand the people you were leading. The young officers, for all their training, had yet to learn that lesson. They still believed that leadership was about power, about showing the world that you were in control. But Jack knew that true leadership was about guiding others, about making them better, about earning their trust. He had seen it in his own mentors, the men who had shaped him into the leader he had become. And now, he was the one tasked with shaping the next generation. The thought was daunting, but it also filled him with a sense of purpose. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Jack stood up and made his way outside. He didn't need to speak to the officers to know that they were ready. They had come a long way since that first day, and while they still had much to learn, Jack was confident that they were on the right path. The training had only just begun, but already, he could see the men they would become. Leaders, not because of their rank, but because of the respect they had earned through their actions. Jack Donovan had played his part. Now, it was their turn. The days blurred into one another as the training continued, and the young officers slowly began to understand the true nature of leadership. They were no longer just learning tactics or perfecting their skills. They were starting to grasp the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. Jack Donovan, ever the observer, watched quietly from the sidelines. He had always been a man of action, a man who led by example. But now, in this phase of his life, he was content to let others take the lead, to shape the future by watching the next generation step up. Lieutenant Hartley, in particular, was beginning to shine. The young officer, once filled with arrogance, had transformed into a thoughtful and decisive leader. Jack noticed the small things, the way Hartley listened to his team, the way he made decisions with confidence, and the way he carried himself with a quiet strength. It was a far cry from the brash officer Jack had first encountered, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The rest of the team followed Hartley's lead, each one growing more capable and more confident in their roles. Jack had known that this day would come, that these young officers would find their footing, but seeing it in action was something else entirely. He had done his part. Now it was their turn to take the reins. One afternoon, as the training exercises concluded for the day, Jack found himself alone in the quiet mess hall once more. He sat at a table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, his mind wandering back to his own time in service. He remembered the early days, when he was like them, full of ambition and uncertainty, eager to prove himself. Back then, he had believed that leadership was all about strength, about making decisions with authority. But as the years passed, he had come to realize that true leadership was about something more. It was about sacrifice, humility, and the willingness to put others first. Jack hadn't always been the perfect leader. He had made mistakes, some of which still haunted him. But in the end, it wasn't about being perfect, it was about doing what needed to be done, no matter the cost. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Lieutenant Hartley appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But then, Hartley stepped forward, taking a seat across from Jack. "Sir," he said, his voice more respectful than Jack had ever heard it before. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. You've taught me more in the past few weeks than I ever could have learned on my own." Jack didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at Hartley, studying him. The young officer seemed different now, less eager to prove himself and more willing to learn. Jack nodded slowly. "You're doing well, Hartley. Just remember, leadership isn't about proving something to others. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. That's how you earn respect." Hartley nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand, sir. I'll keep that in mind." For a moment, there was silence between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that comes after understanding has been reached. Jack knew that Hartley was ready. The rest of the team was ready too. They were no longer just trainees, they were leaders in the making. Jack Donovan had passed on his knowledge, his experience, and now it was time for him to step back. As the evening wore on, Jack left the mess hall, his heart light. He had done his part, and the future of the military was in good hands. The young officers, who had once mocked him, had now seen the truth. They had learned that leadership wasn't about rank or authority. It was about the ability to serve others, to guide them through uncertainty, and to earn their respect through actions, not words. Jack Donovan had taught them well, and he was content knowing that the next generation of leaders would carry the torch forward. The following weeks were a turning point for the young officers. They continued their training with renewed vigor, their previous arrogance replaced by a quiet determination. Jack Donovan, still a constant presence on the sidelines, continued to observe, his sharp eyes noting every detail, every subtle shift in the way the officers interacted with each other. Lieutenant Hartley had become the unofficial leader of the group, his confidence no longer brash but grounded in experience. He moved with a sense of purpose, issuing commands with clarity and leading his team through each exercise with precision. Jack had seen this kind of transformation before, but it never failed to bring a sense of pride. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had dedicated his life to the military, why he had spent countless hours training and mentoring the next generation. These young men and women were the future, and he had played a part in shaping them. But despite the progress, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing. Leadership wasn't just about skill, it was about character, and the true test of a leader came in the most difficult of circumstances. The opportunity for that test came sooner than expected. The training field was filled with the sound of distant helicopters, a signal that the day's exercise was about to begin. But as the officers gathered and prepared for the task at hand, the situation shifted unexpectedly. A new set of orders had come through. The exercise was no longer a routine drill. It had become a real mission. The officers were being tested not just on their tactical skills, but on their ability to handle pressure, to make split-second decisions with the lives of their team on the line. The tension in the air was palpable as the officers scrambled to adjust to the new reality. Lieutenant Hartley, who had been leading the group with confidence, now found himself in uncharted territory. His mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation, weighing the risks, considering the best course of action. Jack watched from the sidelines, a quiet observer as always. But his heart quickened. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when these young officers would prove that they had truly learned what it meant to lead. Hartley's voice rang out, commanding his team to fall into formation. His tone was steady, But Jack could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the weight of the responsibility settling on him. This wasn't just about following orders anymore. It was about taking charge, about making decisions that could mean life or death. Jack knew that this was the real test. The officers worked together with an intensity that Jack hadn't seen before. They moved swiftly, their actions synchronized, each one stepping up when needed. The moments of hesitation were fewer, their movements more fluid, their minds focused on the task at hand. Jack could feel the change in the air. This was no longer a group of individuals, it was a team, and the difference was palpable. As the exercise came to a close, the young officers stood together, waiting for the final evaluation. Jack stepped forward, his face unreadable, as he scanned each of them. They had passed the test, not just in terms of their skills, but in their ability to work as one unit. Jack gave a single nod, a silent acknowledgement of their growth. He didn't need to say anything. They had proven themselves. The silence that followed was thick with understanding. The officers had learned something that day, something that couldn't be taught in any manual. They had learned what it truly meant to lead, not through rank or authority, but through respect, trust, and the ability to make the right call under pressure. Jack Donovan had played his part, guiding them, teaching them. And now, as the sun set over the training field, he knew that the next generation of leaders was ready. He could finally step back, knowing that the torch had been passed. As the weeks went by, the officers continued to show improvement, and the training exercises grew more intense. They had come a long way from the brash, uncertain soldiers they had been at the start. But Jack Donovan knew that there was still more to be done. Leadership was a lifelong journey, and the lessons they had learned so far were just the beginning. One afternoon, as the officers gathered for a briefing, the atmosphere was different. The usual banter had been replaced with a quiet focus. Lieutenant Hartley stood at the front, his posture more confident than ever, but his face betrayed the weight of the situation. Jack noticed the shift in the room. The officers were no longer just following orders. They were thinking critically, making decisions with a sense of urgency that was rare for those so young. The next mission was different from anything they had encountered before. It was no longer just about drills and exercises. It was about real-world application, and the stakes were high. The colonel outlined the mission parameters. It wasn't a combat situation, but the officers would be tasked with overseeing a critical operation, ensuring everything ran smoothly under pressure. It would test their ability to stay calm, make decisions, and take charge when things didn't go according to plan. Jack knew this would be the moment when their true leadership would shine or falter. As the briefing ended and the officers prepared to move out, Jack found himself lingering in the back of the room. He didn't need to say anything. The officers knew he was watching, and they knew the weight of the responsibility on their shoulders. They weren't just representing themselves. They were representing the trust that had been placed in them. Lieutenant Hartley approached Jack, his face a mix of determination and uncertainty. "General Donovan," he said quietly, "I'm not sure we're ready for this. I don't want to fail them." Jack looked at him for a long moment, his gaze steady. "You've learned everything you need to know, Hartley. Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about doing what's right when it matters most." Hartley nodded, but Jack could see the doubt still lingering in his eyes. Jack placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "You'll do fine," he said simply, and then he turned to watch the others as they filed out of the room. The officers moved with purpose, each one focused on the task at hand. Jack felt a sense of pride swell within him. They had come so far, and now they were about to face their biggest test yet. As the officers boarded their vehicles and made their way to the operations site, Jack followed at a distance. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. He was there to observe, to see how they would handle the pressure, how they would rise to the challenge. The operation began smoothly, but as Jack had expected, it wasn't long before things started to go awry. A communication error, a misstep in coordination, small things that could easily spiral out of control. Jack watched from a distance, his eyes scanning the scene, looking for signs of hesitation, signs that the young officers might crumble under the pressure. But they didn't. Lieutenant Hartley quickly assessed the situation, issuing commands with a calm that surprised even Jack. The officers followed his lead, adapting to the changing circumstances with impressive agility. Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had done it. They had faced the pressure and risen to the occasion. As the operation concluded and the officers gathered to debrief, Jack couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. They had not only completed the task, but had done so with confidence and poise. They were no longer just trainees, they were leaders. Jack Donovan knew that his time was coming to an end. He had passed on his knowledge, and now, it was up to them to carry the torch. As he left the debriefing room, Jack felt the weight of his years, the years of service, of teaching, and of guiding others. But there was no regret, no sense of unfinished business. He had done his part. The future of leadership was in good hands. Months passed, and the officers had grown into the leaders Jack Donovan had hoped they would become. Their training was nearing its end, and the final evaluations were approaching. Jack could see how far they had come. Lieutenant Hartley, once unsure and filled with doubt, now led with a steady hand, his decisions firm yet thoughtful. The other officers, too, had developed in ways that Jack hadn't anticipated. They had learned the most important lesson: how to earn respect, how to be true leaders, and how to take responsibility for their actions. Jack felt a quiet satisfaction as he watched them from the sidelines. He had done his part, and now it was up to them to carry the weight of leadership. One day, as the final day of training arrived, the officers gathered for the last briefing. The air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just any final exercise, it was the culmination of everything they had learned. The stakes were high, but there was a sense of calm confidence in the air. Lieutenant Hartley stood at the front, his posture straight and his voice clear as he addressed his team. His words were measured, and for the first time, he wasn't just issuing orders. He was guiding his team, offering them the wisdom and confidence he had gained through his training. Jack stood quietly at the back of the room, observing. He could see that Hartley was ready. The rest of the team, too, was prepared. They had learned how to trust each other, how to move as one cohesive unit, and how to adapt to challenges. The mission they were about to undertake was complex, but Jack had no doubt they would rise to the occasion. As the briefing concluded, the officers filed out of the room, their movements purposeful. Jack followed at a distance, his mind racing with memories of his own final days in training. It felt like a lifetime ago, but the lessons he had learned then were still with him. He knew that, just like his younger self, the officers had yet to face their hardest challenge. But they were ready. The exercise began with a calm precision, the officers taking their positions without hesitation. Jack watched closely, observing their every move, noting how they communicated and how they dealt with the unexpected. As always, there were moments when things didn't go according to plan. The young officers had to think quickly, adapt, and make decisions on the fly. Jack could see how they handled each challenge with confidence, the way they trusted each other's abilities. There were no more second guesses, no more hesitation. They had grown. Jack felt a deep sense of pride as he watched them work together, each officer playing their part without needing to be told. As the final task came to an end, the officers gathered once again, their faces weary but determined. They had passed the test, not just in skill, but in leadership, in the way they had worked as a team. Jack stepped forward, his face unreadable. He gave each of them a long, silent look, one that spoke volumes. There was no need for words. They had earned it. They had proven themselves. Jack's time with them was done. As he walked away from the field, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The next generation of leaders had emerged. They were no longer just soldiers. They were leaders, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Jack Donovan had played his part, and now he could step aside, knowing that the future was in good hands. The weeks after the final training exercise were quieter. The officers had earned their place, and Jack Donovan had seen all he needed to. He watched as the young men and women, once uncertain and brash, now stood taller, their confidence earned through hard work and real experience. The tent that had once been filled with the sounds of hesitation and doubt now stood silent, as the officers continued their tasks with a sense of purpose and unity. Lieutenant Hartley, who had once struggled with his role as leader, now moved with a calm assurance. His orders were clear, his decisions quick, but most importantly, they were based on the respect he had earned from his peers. Jack had seen Hartley grow from an officer unsure of his place into a leader that his team could rely on. It was a transformation that didn't just come from the drills or the tasks they had been given. It came from the way Hartley had learned to trust himself and those around him. Jack felt a quiet pride as he watched the young officers in action. He had been a mentor, a guide, and now he could step back. The lessons had been learned, and the officers were ready. He often found himself reflecting on his own journey, the battles he had faced, the men and women he had led, and the mistakes he had made along the way. But through it all, Jack had learned that leadership was not about being perfect. It was about understanding when to step forward and when to let others lead. He had seen the same growth in these officers. They were ready, but there were still moments when Jack felt the weight of his years. The aches in his joints, the wear of time on his body, and the quietness that came with being on the sidelines. Yet, in those moments, he found peace. He had passed on his knowledge, shared his experiences, and now, he could trust that the next generation would carry the torch. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack sat outside the mess hall, his hands resting on his knees, the cool evening breeze brushing against his face. Lieutenant Hartley approached, a thoughtful look on his face. "General," he said, his voice respectful but casual, "I just wanted to thank you again. I'm not sure I'd be here without your guidance." Jack smiled softly, his eyes meeting Hartley's. "You've earned your place, Hartley. You always had it in you. I just helped you see it." There was a brief pause before Jack continued. "Don't think this is the end of the journey, though. You've taken the first steps, but true leadership takes a lifetime of learning." Hartley nodded, understanding the weight of the words. He wasn't just a leader because of his rank. He was a leader because of his actions, his ability to inspire those around him, and his willingness to learn from the past. As Jack stood up to leave, he felt the weight of his years more than ever, but it wasn't a burden. It was the contentment that comes with knowing you've done your part. The future was in good hands. The young officers, once unsure of their place, had found their way. Jack Donovan had taught them well, and now, it was time for him to step back and watch them lead the way. The days had grown shorter as the final days of training approached, but Jack Donovan knew that the lessons he had instilled in the young officers would last long beyond the end of the program. Lieutenant Hartley, now a confident leader, had fully embraced his role. The once skeptical officers had transformed into a cohesive unit, their trust in one another evident in the way they worked together. Jack observed them from a distance, no longer a guide, but a quiet witness to their growth. One afternoon, as the officers gathered for a final evaluation, Jack felt a sense of calm settle over him. The mission they were preparing for was unlike any they had faced before. It wasn't just a test of skill or ability. It was a test of their leadership, their judgment, and their ability to remain calm under pressure. The room was filled with the sound of hushed voices as the officers went over the mission details. Jack stood in the corner, watching. He knew this was the moment when they would truly prove themselves. As the briefing ended and the officers filed out, Hartley approached Jack, his expression serious but determined. "Sir," Hartley said, "I just wanted to thank you again. I'm not sure I would have made it this far without your guidance." Jack smiled softly. "You've earned it, Hartley. I didn't make you a leader. You did that yourself." The younger officer nodded, taking a deep breath. "I don't feel ready for this," Hartley admitted. "I've learned a lot, but there's still so much I don't know." Jack placed a hand on Hartley's shoulder, his voice steady. "You'll never feel completely ready. Leadership isn't about knowing everything. It's about trusting your team, making the right call when it matters, and learning from every experience, good or bad." Hartley met Jack's gaze, the weight of the words settling on him. "I'll do my best," he said, and Jack could see the sincerity in his eyes. The officers moved to the operations site, their steps purposeful, their minds focused. Jack followed at a distance, his heart filled with a quiet pride. He had seen this group grow from uncertain individuals into a team capable of taking on any challenge. The mission was demanding, but Jack had no doubt that they would succeed. As the operation unfolded, Jack observed from the sidelines, his eyes scanning the scene. The officers worked together seamlessly, making quick decisions and adapting to the changes with impressive agility. Lieutenant Hartley, now fully in control, guided his team with confidence, issuing orders that were met with swift execution. The tension in the air was palpable, but the officers remained calm, focused on the task at hand. Jack's pride swelled as he watched them handle the situation with a level of maturity and leadership that surpassed even his expectations. The mission was a success, and as the officers regrouped for the debriefing, Jack knew that they had passed the ultimate test. They had proven themselves as leaders, not through words or rank, but through their actions. As the day drew to a close, Jack stood in the background, watching the officers exchange words of congratulations. He knew that his time was drawing to an end. His role as a mentor was complete, and now it was their turn to lead. Jack Donovan had seen the potential in these young officers from the beginning. They had learned the hardest lesson: leadership was earned, not given. And as Jack walked away from the field, he knew he had left them in good hands. The next generation of leaders had arrived, and they were ready. As the weeks turned into months, the officers continued their journey, each day bringing new challenges and new opportunities for growth. Lieutenant Hartley, now firmly established as the leader of his team, had grown into the role in a way that Jack Donovan couldn't help but admire. Hartley had gone from being unsure of his place to becoming a leader who inspired confidence in his team, earning the respect of everyone around him. Jack watched this transformation with a quiet sense of pride, knowing that he had played a small part in helping Hartley and the others find their path. The final evaluation had been a turning point, but it wasn't the end. Leadership was not something that could be perfected in a few weeks. It was a lifelong process of learning, adapting, and improving. Jack had passed on the lessons he had learned over the years, but he knew that these young officers still had much to learn. One evening, after another successful operation, the officers gathered in the mess hall to reflect on their progress. The usual chatter and laughter filled the air, but Jack noticed the subtle change in their conversations. It wasn't just about the mission or the tasks at hand anymore. They were talking about the bigger picture, about leadership, about the responsibility that came with their rank. Jack stood at the back of the room, watching, his heart swelling with pride. These were no longer just soldiers, they were leaders in the making. As the officers spoke, Jack realized that his time with them was coming to a close. He had been a mentor, a guide, and now, it was their turn to lead. They had learned what it meant to be leaders, not just by following orders, but by thinking critically, making decisions, and putting the team first. Jack's role had always been to prepare them for this moment, to help them understand the true nature of leadership. And now, he could see that they were ready. Lieutenant Hartley, now standing in front of the room, spoke up, his voice steady and sure. "We've come a long way, but this is just the beginning," he said. "We've learned how to lead, but there's still so much more to do. We're a team, and we've got each other's backs, no matter what." His words resonated with everyone in the room, and Jack could see the unity that had developed among the officers. They were no longer just individuals. They were a cohesive unit, ready to take on any challenge that came their way. Jack didn't need to say anything. The respect and trust in the room spoke louder than any words he could offer. The young officers had become exactly what they needed to be, leaders. As Jack walked away from the mess hall that evening, he felt the familiar weight of age settle on him. The years had taken their toll, but there was no regret. He had given everything he could, and now it was time for him to step back. The future was in good hands, and he could walk away knowing that he had played his part in shaping the next generation of leaders. Jack Donovan had taught them the lessons that had defined his own career, and now, they would carry that knowledge forward. The torch had been passed, and the next chapter of leadership had begun. The months passed, and Jack Donovan found himself reflecting more and more on his journey. The young officers, once full of doubt and uncertainty, had become a solid team, led by Lieutenant Hartley, who had transformed from an unsure soldier to a leader others could rely on. Jack had seen that change unfold before his eyes, and it filled him with a sense of fulfillment that few other moments in life could provide. It wasn't about the missions, or the accolades, or even the recognition. It was about seeing these young men and women grow into the leaders they were always meant to be. They were ready. Jack could feel it in the air, the way they carried themselves, the way they interacted with one another. It was no longer about individual accomplishments. It was about the collective strength of the team. They had learned to rely on each other, to trust each other, and most importantly, to lead with integrity. As the training came to an end, the officers gathered one last time. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, just a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come. Lieutenant Hartley stood at the front of the room, a calm and steady presence. "We've made it," he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "But this is only the beginning. The real work starts now." We've learned how to be leaders, but the journey doesn't stop here. We lead by example, and we keep pushing ourselves to be better every single day. The room was silent for a moment, and Jack felt a swell of pride rise in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the next generation of leaders stood tall, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Jack had done his part. He had passed on the lessons he had learned over the years, and now, it was time for him to step back. The torch had been passed, and the young officers were ready to carry it forward. As Jack walked away from the training facility for the last time, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had given everything he could. He had taught, mentored, and guided. The future was in good hands, and he had no regrets. The officers, now true leaders, would continue the work. They would face their own challenges, but they were no longer just soldiers. They were leaders in every sense of the word. Jack Donovan had played his part, and now, it was time for him to watch from the sidelines as the next generation forged their own path. The world had changed, but one thing remained constant. The true essence of leadership would always live on, passed from one generation to the next.